Okay, so it's already time to start. I would like to welcome everybody at our session here. I'm very glad that we managed to unite here people and experts from absolutely different organizations and different fields. The people who are on disaster risk reduction projects. So I really welcome you here. I also welcome our guests who joined our session online and offline. So why we actually decided to take this topic for our session. You all know, we all discussed in the morning today. This is one of the challenging topic right now in the world. So you know that floods, for example, cause losses for about $40 billion per year dollars. So the questions that we will discuss in today, and I hope we will get some answers or tips to the answers. That's which disaster risk reductions methods and tools are used, where exactly we are working or other organizations are working, what challenges and lessons learned we are experiencing, and what are success stories and maybe sometimes unsuccessful stories, which is also very interesting to hear. And also we will talk a bit about finances, how to get finances for any kind of disaster risk reduction projects. So I would like to invite here our first speaker, that's Ifrat Yobel. So you can put your camera on, Ifrat. Hello. Yeah. So I just would like to introduce Ifrat, who is an international consultant and the principal of Counterpoint. And at your role, she works with the country governments across Africa, Asia, and the EECA region on climate resilience and disaster risk reduction and urban development. So the floor is yours. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Let me start by saying disasters are a very personal thing for me. I'm from Florida. What you see on the screen are the strong cyclones in Florida since 1850. But if we actually look at extreme precipitation events, then Florida is, there's not really an open spot on Florida that doesn't experience really severe weather. So disasters are something I've grown up with, not only on a personal level, but also as a professional. This is something I think we all tend to forget when we're talking about climate change, the increasing climate change, the rate of change, the frequency of change. This is something that comes and starts showing up in the way we look at disasters, the way we perceive disasters, but also in our ability to deal with them, which is something I personally think is a bit underestimated as we deal with that as a whole. We are seeing a lot of these kinds of pictures of flooding, heat waves, fires. All of this is something that all of us are becoming much more familiar with. They're happening in more and more places. They're happening with greater frequencies. And if we look at the expectations, for frequencies and intensities, we can see that we're definitely looking at a long-term trend of increase as temperatures increase. We're more or less around here now, around 1, maybe a bit higher than 1, depending on where you are in the globe. And what we're going to start seeing is significant increases in scope and intensity of heat waves, of flooding, of crop droughts. And if you think of the floods we've had this summer in Europe or are having right now in India, for example, and you think that in less than 10 years, we're looking at a 10% increase on that in terms of amount of water, or if you're thinking of the heat waves that have been experienced, and if you're thinking that, and we're saying that within 10 years, heat waves are gonna be twice as high or hotter in terms of the heat that people experience. That is not something that we're talking as a long-term issue. That is something that we're already experiencing. And when we start looking at disasters from this kind of perspectives, we're already experiencing these significant changes. They're only going to accelerate. Then I think the big question is our disaster management risk or disaster risk management systems ready? Are they even prepared for this kind of change of scopes? So I want to very briefly talk about some of the things we're already seeing, and how I believe they're going to start impacting the way we look at disasters, and some of the issues that have started to crop up in the field or have been starting to be tested in the field. So, for example, as I mentioned, I'm from Florida, so cyclones, or hurricanes as they're known in the US, are near and dear to my heart as a disaster. But for example, since 2017, the typical 72-hour window to evacuate people from a disaster area in advance of a cyclone is no longer feasible or applicable. This is not in 10 years from now. This is already happening for a variety of reasons. And that's a real problem, because you can't evacuate people if you don't know that a cyclone is coming your way. Our prediction software and modeling is not good enough yet to give us a bigger window. And at the same time, they're intensifying so close to the shoreline now and so fast that 3 days out, you think that they're not going to hit you, and you wake up 12 hours before it hits, and you're looking at a mega disaster, right? With super cyclones hitting regularly. This is a real problem for countries. It's a real problem for disaster management system. Because if we can't get people out of the way, which has been the preferred method of avoiding mortality, that means that our systems in all the countries in the world are facing severe challenges. So what are some of the issues that we need to be looking at? So first, we need to start localizing our disaster management approaches a lot more than we have. We need to do better preparation. And by preparation, I don't necessarily mean the education and awareness training programs that are very good and really diverse around the world. But really, if we can't get people away from their housing, so the first question is, and this is sort of a very systemic issue, is how do we improve the regular building stock, right? But the second question is, how do we start improving centralized shelters? And how do we improve the local evacuation processes? How do we prepare and improve shelters in adjacent areas? And how quickly can we get people to adjacent areas as opposed to far away? And then much more critical, I think, is because we cannot evacuate people, that means that the damage that we're going to be experiencing is going to be much harder, which means we're actually looking at a lot more in-country migration due to climate and disasters. These, I have to admit, I don't have answers to these questions, but I do think that the risk management systems need to start asking these questions a lot more, and start figuring out what we can do and cannot do. The other issue, really big issue that I think we need to start looking at, is more nimble response mechanisms and options. In most countries, it's the central government or the federal government that is responsible for emergency response. But what is happening now is that, and again, in the past, when I was growing up, you were told that if a disaster hit your area, you needed to figure out how to manage on your own for 3 days. This is something that has been carried over to the rest of the world. Now, as of 2017, they're telling you need to figure out how to survive a disaster to 5 to 10 days on your own before we can officially ensure that we can get to you. There's a lot of reasons for this. The size of cities, the amount of people, the size of the damaged areas, the amount of infrastructure that gets in the way, the mobilization time it takes, and the fact that obviously you cannot evacuate people, which means that you have a lot more people to manage and deal with after the disaster happens. This is a real issue for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, it means that local government is the first line of response until the central government mobilizes. And local government is actually the least prepared to deal with these kinds of issues, because it is one of the entities or people or institutions that is actually being impacted. So what we get is essentially a donut hole, right, where local government cannot respond immediately due to a whole lot of reasons. But the surrounding communities are not geared up to help, and the central government is still gearing up, because it takes 3 to 5 days for people and equipment and food and water to move into place. If we're lucky and we have really good government and there's nothing else preventing them from moving fast. So these kinds of issues have a lot of implications. Just some of the implications that we have are, first of all, capacity. Capacity at the local level, capacity for fast clearing of roads, which means you need a lot of equipment in the nearby areas, fast location of stranded people, fast evacuation of people. This has a huge financial burden. Fast clearing of roads, fast evacuation of people. I think most of us tend to underestimate how costly this is, and in most countries where you do have the financing mechanisms to enable this kind of activity, it takes something like 2 weeks for the system to come into play, for the money to come through, which means, again, that for 2 weeks, local government need to fund these contracts on their own, fund these activities on their own, and have the money to pay for the contracts, right? You need fast local mobilization capacity. You need increased support for social services. You need evacuation response teams. You need equipment. You need food. You need water. All of these things. And I think, in my opinion, first of all, we need to be better. I think one of the solutions for this is we need to better engage and train citizen organizations and NGOs within your city to be able to conduct response teams. We need to train community emergency response teams. And we need to do this also because you have to remember that your police, your fire department, your emergency departments, they live in your city too, right? Which means they're affected too. You cannot count on them being fully functional. They will not be able to help you, meaning the community, until they are able to ensure that their families are safe. It's something that is well documented in professional research papers, but this is something that tends to be underestimated when we're looking at a centralized response, because you're pulling people from all over the place. But if we have to stay, quote unquote, on our own longer, that means that all your emergency response departments, all your medical people, your police, your fire and emergency departments need to be supplemented with people in your community. So the level of training and awareness that happens has to be looked at much differently and ramped in a whole different way. This also means that you need to very quickly, as a local community, local government, provide centralized guidance for where you need people, to where you're tracking people, right? You can't just have any Tom, Dick, and Harry pop up in a boat or pop up in a truck and start helping people. I mean, it's okay if they do, but you as a community need to know what is happening with these people, what the issues they're facing, what are the challenges, and what needs to happen, right? All of which leads to a really big issue, which is funding. You need consistent funding at the local level. You need a lot more funding that has been considered in most countries to date. And we need to ensure that that funding is accessible, not just that it's theoretically available, but it is accessible. The other issue, which has a really good record in the last 6-7 years, that has been tested very well in Asia, is a stronger focus on pre-disaster cash transfers. I don't know how many of you have actually experienced a disaster, but the first thing that goes is your electrical communications, your credit cards, the credit card systems in any place, right? So cash is king. And especially when we're dealing with low-income countries, most households don't have enough cash to have cash on hand available for a month to survive until everything is working. This has been very successful and has been tested. The Philippines has run quite a few examples, but there have been quite a few cases in Asia where they've done these anticipatory cash transfers that paid in advance, a day in advance, to just about every household to ensure that they have cash. They've been very successful and they've had really good results. There's just been a paper published about this that has tested this. So I think this is really exciting in terms of one of the ways that we can start looking at this. Governments don't like to do this, I have to say. This is giving cash to people in advance without any criteria, without any means. I don't need to tell anybody involved in international development or in thinking about these things some of the horror stories that could come out of something like this. But again, you can plan for this and prepare for it, and it really helps with the recovery period. So, and then I want to talk a bit about the recovery period. Obviously, media attention is focused on the disaster itself, and in a relatively short time, half a year, 8 months after the disaster. But when we look at the period that it takes to rebuild, they are much longer than we typically think, and definitely longer than most governments are ready to think of. So for immediate repairs, you're looking in a best case scenario at something like a year. And if you're looking at full recovery for things coming back to normal, you're looking at closer to a two-year normal. And this is assuming that there are no other disasters that pull away resources and that you have sufficient funding and that has been allocated. This is something that I think as a community we ought to be paying more attention to. Obviously, people who work in the field know how long it takes, but when we think of these systems and how fast they quote unquote bounce back, we tend to underestimate the length of recovery. And I can tell you from personal experience, it takes about 14 months before you start feeling normal again. The stress and the dislocation that you feel, even if you don't experience personal household disaster, but it's just the community that experienced the disaster, it takes a long time to go away. The costs are significant. This is from the US, and you can see that the cleanup periods vary, and the primary recovery, meaning the immediate recovery period, also varies. I can tell you, for example, that the last two lines, Harvey and Irma, Harvey was in Texas, Irma was in Florida, 2 weeks after Harvey, and I can tell you that cleanup period of 2 months is complete and utter BS. 5 months after Irma, we were still cleaning things off the streets in certain areas, but that's okay. You know, these gives us estimations. We're talking billions of dollars. This kind of numbers are not as consistently collected in Europe or in Australia, but the numbers are pretty similar. In low income countries, the numbers could be lower, but that's just because the infrastructure, the levels of infrastructure are just lower. It doesn't mean that the overall impact is less. And also, however long it takes you to clean up doesn't mean there is no direct correlation to the length of time it would take you to recover. It could take you a very long time to clean up and a short time to recover, and vice versa. Okay, which brings us to funding. Most disaster risk funding is national. It comes from the national budget and the national private sector, depending on the country. In the end, we all need to look to our governments for the kind of work they need to do, for the systemic thinking that needs to go into preparedness and definitely into resilience building. But when we're looking overall at what we are putting for disasters, and I don't have these numbers for the national budgets, obviously, but for international development, we're not putting enough money into disaster risk reduction. It is less than 1% of the total of international finance. And out of that, 12% is preparedness, plus minus, 21% is reconstruction, and 65% is emergency response. Obviously, emergency response is incredibly costly. But I do think that 12% of preparedness and mitigation and resilience building is totally insufficient. So I have a couple of thoughts on that, and this is where I'm going to end. First, I think our current approach to finance is focused on soft preparedness interventions and a very strong emergency response. While I'm not advocating for a weak emergency response, I do think disaster risk thinking has fallen or is in the same trap as adaptation, in the sense that there's too much focus on soft approaches and not enough focus on hard, long-term systemic interventions. This is starting to change, but it is not a change that is apparent in the funding. And second, there is, in my opinion, almost no focus on long-term resilient post-disaster recovery. The post-disaster discussion is very weak as a whole. We do not put enough attention into thinking about what the rebuilding needs to look like, not only in terms of individual interventions, some of which are resilient, but the systems as a whole. And too often we end up rebuilding with the same flaws and the same weaknesses as the original area or location that was destroyed. There needs to be so much stronger focus on post-disaster recovery. It needs to be integrated much better into preparedness. I don't know how much I can emphasize this, but I do think that this is where local governments have a really strong position, because if you need to start thinking what an area would look like after disasters and how you will rebuild, not just what you're rebuilding, but how you're rebuilding, and whether or not you need to encourage people to come back to the same location, as difficult as that conversation is, that is something that we need to do in advance, and we need to integrate that into our awareness thinking and our preparedness thinking, so that if a disaster happens, we already know what the next step is, and we're not, as a result of figuring out how we're responding to the emergency, where we're placing people, and really strong focus on putting people back in their homes, we miss the opportunity to improve the long-term resilience of local communities. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Efrat, for a wonderful presentation. I think there will be a lot of questions afterwards.
Happy to answer them.
Yes. So I would like to invite and welcome here Alexei, who is working at UN Recovery and Peace Building Program. And he is working very deeply in the field and will share the experience and investigations that has been done in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to explain a little bit about our study. Why is this important and relevant? Because first of all, the part is what Ukraine today was have two parts. One part is non-control government, territories and poor internet connection. Do you hear me?
Well, let's see. Yeah, very bad connections, and unfortunately, it was good before, but then yeah, it's changed for a different one.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry because I make all my. I don't know what I can do with this connection. Okay.
Yeah, we just don't hear you. Yeah, maybe you just. Yes, we just maybe move to a different speaker, to Oksana, and you will try again to reconnect then. Okay? Okay. Okay, thank you very much then. So we will come back. Yes, yeah, sorry about that. We will try to yes, that's what I said. We have Alexei, who is working very deep in the field. He's in Kramatorsk, and sometimes the connection is really bad. So we'll try our best to fix it. So Oksana, she's the head of experimentation, UNDP Accelerator Lab from Ukraine. She has been working with a lot with grassroots. So Oksana is the one who is trying to find really different innovations, startups, and cheer up different communities. So the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, can you hear me well? Just checking the internet connection. Good. Today I'm going to talk actually about innovations coming from nature. So as Olena mentioned, I'm coming from UNDP Accelerators Lab, and our mission is to find the local innovation pathways. So we are looking at the way how to bring development from the different perspectives. So one of them is looking at the grassroots and what are the local innovation. Another one is to look at the nature and try to think innovation there. So today I'm going to be talking exactly about that, about biomimicry and how we can learn from nature, how we can adapt to disasters and risk. Trust me, nature really had a long-term research and development, 3.6 billion years to discover how to adapt, change, and find the best mechanism, processes, forms to deal with different type of disasters. But let me share my screen. Okay, share. Go. Okay, can you see my screen? Just a short heads up. Okay. So what is biomimicry? I usually start saying that biomimicry is learning from nature. So in this case, everyone is talking about examples of the Japanese speed train. So it used to be very flat, and it was square train that when that train was going into the tunnel, it just hit the air, and then it needs to put a lot of energy to push through the tunnel. So energy, noise, and low speed, that was the problem. And luckily, the main engineer, he was also an ornithologist. So he looked at the kingfisher bird and look how the kingfisher bird just go from the air to the water, from one environment to another one, and without any noise and really fast. So he said, why don't we look at the aerodynamics of this movement of the kingfisher and do the same with the Japanese train? So from now the train is following the nose of the kingfisher and going through the air as the hot butter is going, a hot knife is going to the butter really fast and reduce the energy consumption and now not creating noise. So that's the clear example of biomimicry, how we take some shapes, processes from the nature and bring it to our problem, human problem. It's a bit different from the biodesign when we are just looking for nature as an inspiration to a static form. So in this case, we just look at the shapes. But in case of the train, we not just use this shape because it's beautiful. We use this particular shape of the nose of the kingfisher because it's reduced the energy consumption. It solved the issue of noise and so on. So when we look at the nature, at the forms and the processes and the ecosystem, that's the biomimicry. And just repeating myself, we can learn from nature, just repeating its form, as the case of the nose of the kingfisher. We can look at the processes and learn how things going on in the nature and apply it to our human challenges or to the whole ecosystem. But now you're saying to me, so where's this disaster risk reduction? So just a second, and I'm gonna go through each of these model of learning from nature and explain how we can learn from nature in the disasters. So first, it's going to be about forms. So when we look at the bees hives, we realize that it's one of the most stable and efficient forms on the earth. So there's a lot of mathematicians working on it and trying to understand how and why the hexagon is the best form and the most structurally efficient. And already we start applying it to our infrastructure. We learn that it's the most efficient way to use space. And if we use the hexagon instead of squares, we increase the resilience of the infrastructure. So it's bump away really easier. And we don't have to have really strong structure like metal and so on. It can be very lightweight to be still very resilient. So we see application of hexagons, for example, in the tires or in wonderful earthship projects in UK or in the water ice in China. We see that those structures, those shapes are already being applied in the infrastructure to make it more resilient with being very lightweighted. So this is how we copy the form. And then let's talk about processes. So we see that the corals, for example, they can renovate themselves. We see that when there's a disaster, the new coral can just give a branch and start a new coral. We also see in our bones that when the space where we put a lot of weight or when we put a lot of impact, there's bone starts increasing. So we see these self-healing processes in the nature, but we don't see it in our infrastructures, for example. So the new invention, biomimic invention, suggests new type of concrete, where inserting the bacteria in this concrete, and when the concrete have a crack, the bacteria is actually creating limestone and healing itself. So this kind of alive concrete is also possible. And when we have cracks, the concrete is actually healing itself, similar to the bones or to the corals. This is how we copy the processes. But if we look, I think the most impressive is to learn from the ecosystem. You see here the cone, and this is the cone from Yellowstone Park. They had a big fire, and it's managed to resurrect very easily. Why? Because this pine in Yellowstone Park has two types of cones. One that's usually reproduce, and one they open on the really extreme heat only. So when there's the fire, there's this particular cones that will open only in extreme heat and give a burn to a new completely forest. This is one example of how we can prepare to different disasters that are coming, like fires, floods, and so on. This is another example from the ecosystem. It's a prairie ecosystem that has lots of different species, and one that are surviving where there's a lot of rain, and one that are surviving where there's a lot of drought. And this biodiversity and diversity of different options, this is the success of the ecosystem to adapt to disaster. But also its flexibility, it's not so robust. It's easy to change, and number of species are helping us to adapt. Just to give us a human example, we have in this new concept, very popular in China, Sponge City. So in the moment where the drought, it's a park for kids to play. But when it is flooding, it's a pond. So that's very much adaptable ecosystem approach that we see in the nature. In general, I could talk about it quite a lot, but there are a few life principles from nature that the Biomimicry Institute define. They are adapting to changing condition, as in the case, as I said, about the blood in ponds and the sponge city concept, but also evolve to survive, a life-friendly chemistry, locally attuned, and so on. All of them can be applied the way how we tackle disaster risk reduction. I just want to say, since our speech is really short, when we design our infrastructure, for example, in the city, we try to go like robust and very strong, but nature goes, well, changeable, very lightweight, easy to adapt and change. And that's something we try and we can learn from nature. I stop here, but I'm not gonna leave you like this, wondering, okay, so what? So how can we learn from nature? I really recommend you to go here. It's like an encyclopedia of the all nature inventions. It's called asknature.org. So you go there and you type any type of nature-related learning that you want to have. So for example, how do I create structure that adapt? Or how do I create a system of early warning? You just have to think smart how you type your question. It's kind of a Google of nature. Just to find a time after this session, just go there, type few of the questions related to how you adapt to disaster, and just start wandering together of nature. And if you got interested in the topic of learning from nature and adapting it to disaster risk reduction, please write to me at oksana.udovik@undp.org. I will be happy to talk with you and maybe start new exploration project together with you. So that's all from me, and I will be looking to questions from your sides.
Oksana, thank you very much for an inspirational talk, because when we are thinking about disaster, that's always something pessimistic and something we need to tackle somehow. And here's kind of an inspiration that we can do something actually about the disasters, just learn from nature. Thank you again. So please, if you have any questions, we have a special place, question and answers. You can write down the questions there. And after the presentations, we will have the special time for questions and answers. And our speakers will be answering your questions. So we will try with Oleksiy again. So welcome again from Kramatorsk. Let us try. So we will have the video off, just in case it will help. Oleksiy. Oleksiy? No, still doesn't work. So then we will go to the next speaker, Andrew Bauer. He's in charge of Sendai framework monitoring by national authorities across the region. And so he's engaged in urban resilience. So Andrew, the floor is yours. If you would like to share the presentation by yourself, so you can just press the screen down. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olena. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry I can't be with you in person in Malmö today. My name is Andrew Bauer, as Olena kindly introduced. I lead the team here actually on risk governance in the regional office for Europe and Central Asia of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. So a sister agency to the UNDP colleagues joining here. My coverage here and my intervention today over the next few minutes will be slightly broader. I'm going to take you out slightly towards a regional perspective, even probably global perspective, on how everything that we have already heard from Efrat, from Oksana, and we will hear from colleagues, can be can be, we hope, maximized or made most efficient by connecting the dots and convening the partners around the important issue that is disaster risk reduction. And I cannot state more clearly than what Efrat mentioned earlier about the importance of focusing on the long-term resilience perspective when addressing disaster risk reduction and preparedness. As we learned from the pandemic crisis that we're hopefully soon behind us, that investing in prevention and preparedness is critically important to reduce the burden on response and recovery. But it means for introduction, I will share my screen now so that I can accompany my presentation with a few slides. I'm trying to make this work. Please give me 1 second. You should soon be seeing my screen. And I'm now going into. So please, Olena, can you confirm orally if you see my screen?
Yes, that's wonderful.
Anyone anymore. I can only see my slides. Okay.
Yes, they're wonderful.
So in terms of my perspective, which is slightly broader than what the colleagues have introduced so far, but giving a sense of perspective of how we can make the most, and we would like to really bring those various experiences together under a convening space, which is bringing together not only cities engaged in resilience, but also the partners involved in resilience. Hence the title of my presentation today focused around the partnerships for resilience. And all this as a flagship initiative to do with the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative, which was launched last year, and in which a number of partners, including colleagues here from UNDP, are involved in this global partnership to drive a global network for city resilience. And we're extremely delighted to see a number of cities from the region join this initiative, including a good conversation via our colleagues with ICLI, with the hosting city of Malmö. So extending here my welcome remarks to engaging further with the city of Malmö and partners here today present in the room or online to follow this presentation. Quickly, the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative is a follow-on initiative to the Making Cities Resilient campaign that you may have heard before about, that focused on the previous decade of engagement. And so now here, the continuation of this initiative is really to elaborate a greater focus on the city's journey to resilience. So following the resilience roadmap set by this MCR 2030 initiative, focusing on 3 key pillars, which I think provide elements of resonance to what Efrat was mentioning earlier around the knowledge of disaster risk, understanding what it means to reduce risk, what are the disasters in one's local or subnational context, what are the various risk reduction capacities required to engage. And once that knowledge is established, how to establish the right planning for disaster risk reduction. Here, I would like to emphasize the distinction to be made from our perspective between planning from a response and preparedness perspective from an operational angle, with a planning which looks more at that longer term resilience dimension that Efrat was mentioning earlier. And that really brings into perspective a number of different activities or angles or priority areas. And Oksana's insights into how nature-based solutions can be an element of answer from our perspective need to be an integral part of this planning or this planification perspective for risk reduction. And finally, and I hope our colleagues from EBRD will maybe be able to connect to that component, is the element of implementation. Cities, local authorities, local governments will have plans, will have the right knowledge, but do they have the capacity and resources to implement appropriately? And I think that final question raised as part of the panel discussions around how to finance all this is critically important. So how do we investigate, how do we instigate the right risk financing measures to support the local strategies and plans in place to enhance resilience? Going back to the initiative, and as I was saying, the whole objective here is to see how, by bringing together the different key partners engaged in local resilience, we are able to drive a co-owned and co-delivered initiative, which is at a starting point a global network. So here you have on the slide a few of the core partners that are driving this initiative forward in terms of strategic guidance, and that are overseeing the work that myself at the regional office, Europe, Central Asia, but also colleagues in other regional contexts are engaging around MCR 2030. Specifically in the Europe and Central Asia region, here are a number of those partners with whom we're engaging closely to drive this process forward. And actually we see here really colleagues from MSB who are at the national level, the host of this week's conference in the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. We have UNDP at the level of regional hub in Istanbul driving this process. And I think all these different partners are coming together to establish what could be the next priority areas that the MCR 2030 could work around, and how can we establish the right momentum to engage those cities involved at a very local level who are experiencing exactly what Efrat was mentioning earlier and may benefit from being connected with different partners, but also within cities amongst themselves. So just out of a coincidental mention that this semester, these partners are thinking together on how are nature-based solutions contributing to local resilience, and a number of Oksana's points on how do we learn from ecosystems and nature-based solutions were very insightful and may gain from being injected into that reflection and shared within the network of cities in the MCR 2030. So Oksana, I'd be delighted if we could connect at a later stage, including with your regional colleagues, to see how that can be connected. In terms of instruments, these partners are all bringing these different perspectives of what is being done in their national context or the regional context or even local context when they are very localized actors. In the context of UNDRR, for example, we work with scorecards, baseline assessments for resilience, where based on 10 principles and a large number of indicators, cities are supported in defining a resilience assessment of their city context, as well as possibly doing so in the context of public health systems, using the scorecard for public health resilience. And all of these components, from our perspective, are systematically injected as much as we can in the UN broader effort at country level. I share here an example of the socioeconomic response and recovery plan we established or contributed to establishing in Moldova. And of course, we'd like to see with colleagues in Ukraine, for example, how what we do in the regional context may connect with some of the elements that other UN partners are doing in country contexts, and may see some room to contribute to this broader socioeconomic response to COVID, and more broadly to disaster resilience in general. In fact, we are starting to do some work with a few cities in Ukraine, namely starting with the city of Mariupol at a very early stage on supporting their resilience assessment at a city level, working with partners who have much more of a grounded operational nature in their work, and collaborating to support this process in the coming few weeks. And we'll be happy to connect here with the colleagues from UNDP Ukraine and others to share and see how we could possibly collaborate in this respect. But this network is not necessarily only about providing a one-way transfer of information about what partners are offering cities and cities exploring. It is also about incentivizing this notion of city-to-city peer learning. So we aspire in the next months and years to establish ways for cities to engage between themselves on some form of twinning type of process, where experience can be shared over disaster resilience, and how good practices, and as Olena was saying, sometimes bad practices, can be lessons learned for the future, and how these can be established. We recently managed to connect cities like the city of Chisinau with the city of Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, to explore how the experience in establishing an assessment of resilience in the context of Chisinau, Moldova, may contribute positively to this similar exercise being carried out in the context of Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. So we see these practical examples of sharing of experience we would like to promote more through this process. Exactly, as resilience building here is about creating an environment, a trusted environment, where officials of local governments can exchange, they can build work with different partners and contribute to broader advocacy of their work by establishing twinning or collaborations with other cities, many of which exist and are hosts today. ICLEI have a very good track record of connecting cities in their respective networks. And we are working closely with ICLEI, who is the co-chair of our regional coordinating committee for the next 2 years, to try and see how we can establish that similar connection in the context of this broader global initiative. And finally, in terms of connecting and establishing partnerships, we really acknowledge the value of role models, resilience hubs, cities that are at the forefront of the resilience agenda and are in a position to share and inspire other cities in engaging on resilience issues. The resilience hub status is one that one which cities can apply for and be recognized in the global network as a champion for DRR, a champion able to establish connections, contribute, and support cities in knowledge sharing. And we are working with a few cities in Sweden, for example, in establishing their status and good practice examples as role model cities, resilience hubs, as we name them, in the context of the MCR 2030. I'm sharing here the few details about how you may wish to join the network for MCR 2030, as these slides, I'm sure, will probably be shared on the broader Resilience Forum platform, and with some details on some hyperlinks that you may want to consult to be able to access some of these. And I will leave you with a word from the UN Secretary General on reiterating what Efrat was saying earlier, actually, that the pandemic, like many disasters, but the pandemic has really reminded us the importance of prevention and preparedness for effective response and recovery. It is part of the solution and should be considered as equal, if not equal priorities on an equal standing point as our response and recovery efforts to work towards this long-term resilience that we have been mentioning in this panel today. I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much for your few minutes of attention. I'll hand back over to you, Elena, in the hope that the connection is still on and that you can still hear me.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew, for the presentation. And I hope that we had here also representatives for cities to hear about what's going on, about the program that you have and campaign. And in the near future, you will have more cities that will join the program. Thank you very much again for joining the session. So we will have again the next one more try to connect to Alexei. I never give up faith and optimism. So let us try, Alexei.
Okay, I'm trying. How you see me?
That's good. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank
just
you.
A moment. We will ask our help, Rebecca, to put the presentation online.
Okay.
Yeah, just a moment, just 1 minute.
I can talk about our study before this presentation.
Yes, the presentation is on, so you're welcome.
Everything good. As for today, first of all, I want to say thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elena, because it was very hard to connect it. I don't know why, but it was very hard. Thank you. As for today, when we have two industrial regions of Ukraine are separated by contact line, the situation follows. The non-government control area is high and in the landscape, and the government control part. The coal mines in non-government control area are closed and flooded for today without water pumping. All water flows into the coal mines in the rest part of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. If the water flowing of territories is not controlled, the consequence will be catastrophic. That's why this study is very important and relevant. Please, next slide. Thank you. In this slide, we see our segment and pilot facilities is 3-4 coal mines which we have in government control area. Is the very biggest coal mines, and we start our study in this state enterprises. Eastern enterprise Toretsk coal mines is Centralna and Toretskaya. Toretsk is Donetsk region, and Lysychansk coal mines is Melnikov and Chernomorka. The research result are specific recommendation for the environmental management system of coal mines closure, which real negative environmental consequence for specific area at the regional and local levels. Please, next slide. This is characteristic of our pilot coal mines which we have. You will see this technogenic load and some parts which something like source or factor of influence. This only for standard enterprises Toretsk Google. Please, next slide. This slide is about atmospheric air condition, which we have for today. It's very, it's not high parts because this part of Toretsk Google nearly 60% not is closed for today. Please, next slide. It's a condition of soils and mode of quality of underground and surface water. Main water is located at level horizon the drinking water, and if it enters the drinking water horizon, it will bring the almost all related chemical pollutions, because it's very dangerous. Please, next slide. Yeah, these scenarios of environmental degradation in case of non-compliance with environmental protection measures. We studied all of scenarios, and you see this is very hard. Please, next slide. This is territory of coal mines Toretskaya and Centralna. Please, next slide. This is second of pilot territories located of Lysychansk coal and Chernomorka coal mines, Luhansk Oblast. This is some kind of previous slide, but all about two pilots. Technogenic loads or source or factor of influence. Please, next slide. This characteristic of Lysychansk and Chernomorka: atmospheric air condition and the condition of soils. If necessary, I can send this presentation who have interest about that. Please, next slide. Lysychansk and Chernomorka, regime of quality condition of groundwater and surface water. In a table, we see that place of sampling and indicator, what we do, what we have to. Please, next slide. Screenshot of environmental degradation in case of non-compliance with environmental protection measures. This some kind of previous, but we have this another problem nearly 4 factors which can these factors can be more dangerous than previous. Please, next slide. This characteristic of Первомайска. Please, next slide. This territory of coal mines of Zolote and Nova. Первомайск вугілля. Please, next slide. This characteristic of location, this coal mines. Please, next slide. And I want to finish my presentation this slide because it's identification of priority measures for all coal mines which we do. In the winter, we must start in big comprehensive data gap analysis on process of closure coal mines and green cards for closing mines followed by revitalization of territory. And this is this study is our background. Because on this background, we make big comprehensive data gap analysis. All coal mines which are located on government control areas, and we must make green cards for closing for every coal mines. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei. Thank you for the presentation. And I think that's a very challenging issue to work with the mines and revitalization of the mines. We have the report from Alexei, which we can also share to everybody. Okay, thank you very much. And we are moving to Nigel Yolland, who is a sustainable energy and climate financing policy professional and has 20 years experience leading innovations across multiple sectors and levels of the government. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena, and good afternoon, everybody. Hello here from London. I wish I could be there with you for those of you who are in Malmo. So I don't know if many of you saw my presentation in the plenary. So what I'd like to do is give a brief overview about what is green cities, have a look at how we incorporate green cities, and then I'll take a specific deep dive into how we're applying green cities in Ukraine. And I'll give some examples, mainly in Lviv and Kiev. So there will be some repetition in what I'm saying here compared to what I put in plenary. So if you recall, in the plenary, I mentioned the story of Mungtuya Nyamdoj of Ulaanbaatar. I could have a similar story about my friend Sergei in Kiev. Sergei, who I worked with for a long time at the EBRD, he was very concerned about the traffic congestion and air quality in Kiev and its effect on his son's health. Now, as I said earlier today, that he's not alone, that there are many people concerned about how their lives in cities is affecting them, their infrastructure, and their families. And so this is where EBRD Green Cities comes in. Some of you may have heard about the program. It's now one of the larger infrastructure investment programs focusing specifically on cities in the world. And it has a bit of a difference in that it's linking investments with the systemic strategic approach that we take through green city action plans. It has 4 components, and again, apologies if I'm repeating if you've already heard this. Investments, where we finance actual action by cities in infrastructure, green infrastructure. And I can talk more about the details of how we decide what is green infrastructure versus non-green. Second is the Green City Action Plans, these strategic instruments, of which we have a number underway in Ukraine, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Third is capacity building and knowledge sharing, and something I didn't mention this morning was our Green City Officers Network. We have 51 cities in the EBRD Green Cities program, and each of those cities has nominated one person who is a Green City officer. For example, in Lviv, Justina Lukove is our Green City officer and is very active in this network of knowledge sharing across cities. The criteria for joining cities, and this is a particular strength, I think, of our EBRD approach, is that we tend to focus mainly, but not exclusively, on the smaller, medium-sized cities. We do have capitals like Kiev that are members, but also we work with smaller cities that get less attention, but still need significant support. For example, in Ukraine, Mariupol and Khmelnytsky. So population needs to be greater than 50,000. Second, we require the city to engage with us in a trigger investment. So there needs to be some, as we say in English, some skin in the game. And finally, the cities need to commit to doing a Green City Action Plan. Okay, so the program as a whole, EBRD Green Cities, has 51 members now, 7 of which are in Ukraine. More on this later, but important to point out that there are more green cities in Ukraine than any other country of our network. And we have 22 countries across our countries of operation for the bank. And just some basic statistics. We have invested in more than 1.1 billion euros of green city investments, half of which are what we call follow-on investments. So those are investments that happen after a Green City Action Plan. The actions that we have, these investments have led to saving about 1,100 tons of CO2 per year. It's equivalent to about 250,000 cars off the road a year. And we have completed nearly 20 city GCAPs, Green City Action Plans, which outline specific investment priorities, and 12 additional are underway. So you can see around about 30 cities currently have completed or are underway developing their Green City Action Plans. In addition to the action plans, we really focus on stakeholder engagement. Across the 20 GCAPs, 19 in fact, GCAPs that have been completed and approved, about 81,000 people have been involved from citizens in those cities in helping to set the priorities for their city. In terms of resilience, so this is the second part of my intervention, we build resilience into EBRD Green Cities through our risk and vulnerability assessment approach. This looks at listing hazards relevant to the city, identifying the impacts of climate stress and shocks on infrastructure, assessing the vulnerabilities, so the sensitivity of communities, systems, and assets to those hazards, and analyzing and prioritizing the risk. Again, this is with the stakeholder engagement. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of EBRD Green Cities. Let's have a look now how the development of this program in Ukraine. So we have 7 cities in Ukraine that have joined: Lviv, Kiev, Mariupol, Khmelnytsky, Kryvyi Rog, Dnipro, and Kharkiv. So those cities, as I said, more cities in Ukraine than in any other country. And they're at different stages in their Green City Action Plan development. For example, Lviv has now completed their GCAP and that was approved in July. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Kiev is underway, as is Mariupol and Khmelnytsky. So all three of those GCAPs look like they'll finish off. Well, Kiev probably will finish by the end of this year or early next year, and Mariupol and Khmelnytsky, they are due for completion next year. For those of people who are dialing in from those cities, if you are not already engaged, I would encourage you to get engaged. In Mariupol, for example, at the last stakeholder workshop, we had nearly 100 people from the city involved. So let's have a look at Lviv first. This GCAP was approved in July 2021. We had about 185 participants, stakeholders in the GCAP development from around the city, representing different groups. It came up with about 37 actions. Most of those were investment actions, about 70%, and then the remainder were policy reforms required. Now, in terms of risks and vulnerability, in Lviv, the Ecology and Natural Resources Unit, they completed a survey and they identified three main risks. One was the excessive heat from the heat island experienced during hot periods in summer. The other one was extreme high winds from increasingly common storm events and intense rainfall. So what does that mean for Lviv? Well, now they're in the process of developing their climate adaptation resilience plan. It's currently under development, and the EBRD is looking forward to be able to support that implementation with investments. In terms of Kiev, so the Green City Action Plan is underway, and the risk and vulnerability assessment has been completed. This draws on the general plan of Kiev, which really focuses on the main threat to the city, which is the risk of flooding. Significant flood risk in the city. I think in 2021, about 27,500 hectares were flooded this year. And that compares to about 17,000 hectares in 2019. So significant increase. The Kiev GCAP is due for completion, as I said, late this year, early next year, and we'll be supporting that again with investments. In terms of the investments, as I said, we need a trigger investment in Lviv. It was a solid waste investment of 20 million euros for increase and modernization of the solid waste management infrastructure. In Kiev, there was a district heating upgrade for the modernization of the district heating system. This was a 70 million euro investment from the EBRD. Now, I'd just like to finish off with a point coming back to Andrew's intervention about some of the challenges associated with implementation of infrastructure resilience in Ukraine. So I think there are three main challenges that we have experienced. First of all is the debt capacity, the ability of cities to borrow money. They can't fund everything off their own balance sheet, so they need to be able to access finance. And the limitation, particularly post-pandemic, when city finances were quite rightly focused on pandemic recovery, the debt capacity is very low. So it's very difficult for cities to borrow for this infrastructure need. The second is the bankability of projects, the need for their technical due diligence to be conducted. And while in Ukraine, that's not so bad as it is in other countries that we work in, it's still a challenge for us. And third is the technical capacity within the city administrations. Not so much the level of training, but more the actual capacity and the numbers of people that are available in the administrations. So those are three significant challenges that we have addressed and have experienced in our work. So just to finish off then, I think that EBRD Green Cities provides quite a support and an important role to play in helping cities, because cities can't really be left on their own to deal with these resilience challenges. It needs a partnership between cities, stakeholders, national governments, international financial institutions, private financiers. And if we as EBRD Green Cities can actually help cities in Ukraine, and I hope that that support will help people like my friend Sergei in Kiev to be able to breathe easier in the future. So with that, Elena, back to you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nigel, for the presentation and for the overview of the program that you are doing, and especially in Ukraine. A big thank you for this overview as well. Now we have a questions and answer session, and there are some questions already appeared. If you have some more questions, so you're really welcome to write it in a special place called Q&A. I would kindly ask our presenters to put your camera on, just to have so other people would see you. And I will just read loudly the questions, and so please react who would like to answer those questions. So the first one that I see is the question from Margarita. So my question is that climate adaptation requires long-term commitment far beyond typical duration of each political administration. So how do you ensure continuously across different city administrations? So who would like to answer the question? I think we already a little bit discussed it in the morning, but so you're welcome to answer.
Let me take a shot at this. First of all, I think it's not just city administrations; it's all national or subnational administrations. I think the only way we can do this is, first of all, you have to have broad acceptance for the long-term goals. Number one. Number two, we need to have short-term wins combined with long-term implementation. And we have to realize that our funding cycles for projects or for budgets, they're not built for long-term thinking. This is why it's so important to have these programs or processes like the national adaptation plans, like long-term thinking on city plans, urban plans, master plans. Each country calls it a different name, right? Because a project cycle, you're looking at 2 years to develop a project if you're lucky, 2 years or 3 years or 4 years max to fund the project. If you're looking at a budget, you're looking at a midterm budget of 5 years, and that's a reallocation ask. That's not necessarily what you'll get to implement. That's nothing in terms of the kind of interventions and the kind of thinking and the kind of changes that we're talking about. And we have to put in long-term processes that have broad agreement across the political spectrum on how or what the long-term objective is, even if there are arguments and disagreements on how you get to that point.
Thank you, Efrat. Nigel, please.
So this is something that we deal with all the time. We develop these Green City Action Plans, which have an outlook 5 to 10 years. And if we're dealing with political mandates that only last 3 or so years, then we're bound to have overlaps with political administration. And the way that we do it is the following. So we sign an agreement with the city to engage with them to develop the plan. Sometimes that plan happens within the current mayoral cycle. Sometimes it doesn't. For example, in Kiev, we signed the agreement with the mayor to proceed, and then there was elections last October in the middle of the Green City Action Plan process. We then had to make sure that we kept an open dialogue with him, as well as keeping up with what happens with the new mayor. Okay, so he was re-elected. In the case of re-election, because we have a relationship on the ground, we have people in the offices, we are making sure that we go to the administration and reconfirm commitment for this plan. And this has happened across multiple cities that we've worked in, where we've had to re-engage with the mayor, make sure that they see this as a bipartisan issue, not just the project of the previous mayor. And so it takes a lot of relationship building and commitment, not just from within the city, but also from the, what we call, I guess you could call the EBRD an important stakeholder. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. And I think this is also the answer to the next question. How do you convince the new mayor that the resilience strategy developed during the previous mayorship should be continued? So exactly, legally. So we are signing any kind of the contract and yeah, convince that that's not really the project of the previous mayor. That's something that's a long term.
Exactly.
But
in fact,
it's,
just one more point on that. But if we put the requirement for this Green City Action Plan development and implementation in the loan agreement of many of our loans, so it becomes a legal requirement. Sorry, Efrat.
Yeah, no problem. The other aspect is the plans need to be adopted. For example, if you're doing a city plan, right, an urban master plan or whatever, that plan has a legal framework within each country, and it has a legal life that comes with it. If you do these plans properly and you integrate the right aspects of long-term resilience into the plan instead of doing pro forma plans, as soon as that plan gets adopted, it doesn't matter who politically is in power, it has to be implemented. Obviously, you know, there are links to national budgets and tie-ins, but in the end, an adopted plan is a legal document, whether it's an extra government document such as EBRD or an integral document of the national or subnational government. Yep.
Yes, Andrew, please.
Thank you, Verolina. No, I difficult to disagree with what the colleagues have said. On the contrary, in a full agreement with what was said, and particularly Efrat's point about the ambition of setting this in the legal stone, of making sure that legal infrastructure back up the strategic framework set in place. One element I think which it fits that dynamic, which is not an answer to an issue of political milestones, but of course these frameworks need to be implemented in a whole of government, whether it's local or national, but also a whole of society approach. So this approach of multi-stakeholders engaged in implementation of these frameworks is critical and creates accountability of political leadership on this. So while it is not an answer, as I said, it is an important complementary element which needs to follow this more structural component of integrating strategic frameworks in the legal apparatus if possible, binding it to some financial decision-making on the long term, as Nigel was saying, but also engaging grassroots communities, stakeholders from both public, private sectors, NGO, that will create some form of broader conversation that may supersede the political waves that happen every 4 or 5 years, depending on the countries you engage in. So again, the multi-stakeholder component, critically important for a solid risk governance approach to local resilience building through strategies. Thank you.
Yeah, Elena, one last point on the on what Efrat said about the need for adoption. We track the completion of the Green City Action Plans and the adoption. So we've completed 19, 18 have been adopted. And that means that they have been put into, in some cases, the formal capital expenditure plan that the city has in place. And those plans are very important because that binds the city to an investment plan, usually for 5 years, and nothing outside of that plan can be invested in. So in order to integrate the GCAP into those capital investment plans is critical. And that's the adoption process.
Yeah, thank you very much for really to the point answers. In Ukraine, for example, we are experiencing the change of the minister again. So that's very relevant to our country as well. So another question, I think this is for EBRD. Wish EBRD and EIB financing green solutions outside EU instead of transport corridors crisscrossing natural and cultural landscapes? Any feedback on this issue? I think that's for Nigel.
Yeah, sure. We do finance green solutions outside the EU, and I gave you some examples. For example, the Lviv solid waste, the Kiev district heating modernization, including a range of others, from street lighting in Amman, electric buses in Batumi, you name it. So we do, and this is our aim within EBRD Green Cities.
Okay, thank you. And the question from Alice Daniela: how to engage citizens' participation in local climate resilience? Sometimes we perceive this only as a role of the governments. Any feedback or reflections on that?
It's not an easy process. Not only do you need to get agreement at the technical level of the governments and the local governments, but you also need to get citizen engagement. There are a lot of ways to do it. I think any who's dealt with adaptation and disaster risk has spent a lot of time building coalitions, but it's also about getting people involved. My personal favorite is to find people who are impactful in the community, whether it's in each community, there are always these influences, right? People who are important, whether it's the priest or whether it's a shopkeeper who everybody listens to, whether it's a matriarch in a family or in an extended family, or a restaurant owner, or someone whose voice carries in the community, and getting them on board, I think, is one of the first important steps. Getting young people involved to start integrating, getting pieces of the discussion involved. I mean, there's so much time we can spend talking about building coalitions. It's not an easy process. It's a long-term process, and you have to be willing to bear with it. I do think that governments listening to the citizens and taking a much more participatory approach to developing long-term plans actually supports engagement, and you will see long-term participation. You know, in the end, we each of us as citizens has a responsibility to be aware of what our government is doing, and to be involved with commentary on what it is doing, and to make sure that we inform our elected officials of that, so that they can integrate that into their thinking and activities, in addition to support of civil society organizations. I mean, Andrew can probably talk about that a lot more, because MCR has some really great campaign building processes and programs.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, by the way, we also are working in UNDP Ukraine a lot with grassroots, and we have even special program and a tool that has been developed by Acceleration Lab together with our partners, which is called Community Safari. And from my experience, because I'm already the user of this tool, in 1 month we had on board 108 cities who participated in the whole program of Community Safari like this, because it's really effective. The communities understand what exactly to do, which NBS projects or disaster risk reductions they can apply in a particular city, even in a particular region, and in a particular district of the city. So any reflections here, or we just have the last question on the private sector, yes, Nigel.
I can give some observations on stakeholder engagement from Green City side, because as I mentioned, we've had some experience with this 81,000 people being engaged. I think there are 3 critical points. First of all, we need resources. It's not something that you can just say will happen without resourcing it. You need money just to pay for a hall. You need money for promoting the events. Second, you need political buy-in. Not all political leaders are so enthusiastic about stakeholder engagement, and cultural differences as well. And third, what we do is we require the teams working on the Green City Action Plans to develop stakeholder engagement plans. That's the kind of preliminary thinking of who we're going to speak to, how are we going to speak to them, and when. So we have that mapped out at the beginning, and we get sign off from the city. So if the city, at that point, the city is kind of committed. And those three things have held us in good stead, I think, to be able to attract a lot of people getting engaged in civil engagement. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Oksana, you wanted to add?
Well, from my side, I see just one question regarding innovations, but before moving to this, I just wanted to add on the community safari and grassroots involvement and citizen involvement that we very often underestimate the possibility that people can do and how can they transform their city, starting from the bottom up. And we already see that in Ukraine, thanks to the community safari, communities are making rainwater garden to protect it from flooding. They're making the urban heat islands using the tree planting and so on, and green walls. So they're going even faster than the municipality sometimes. And what we observe that actually this network of grassroots initiatives can be like a living system, like a living organism changing their own cities. But inviting everyone to check the community safari again and nature-based solutions for adaptation to disasters. Little advertisement. But regarding the innovation that we supported, if we can copy paste to other cities, I think yes, not. I really recommend you to go to asknature.org and to see a number of innovation like self-healing concrete, or the way how you design the new buildings based on new shapes and forms, and a number of different nature-based solutions you can find there. You can easily copy-paste them. What you cannot copy-paste is this kind of ecosystem thinking, that you create and plan something not to be robust and stable, but something that is really, imagine you're on the surfboard or you are on the snowboard. This is how the system should react, no? So you are standing there and you're on the snow and you're changing depending on how system works. So that's how we have to design our response. So it's all the time changing. So all the time looking to feedbacks and loops and able to move to opposite direction very, very quickly. So that's type of thinking that we have to develop. And I believe we can learn quite a lot how the nature do this.
Yeah, thank you, Oksana, for your reflection. I think we already need to stop here because it's already the end of our session. I would like to thank you very much for all your preparation and participation in the session. And I really appreciate that I know you because you are the leaders who inspire others to make changes in nature and to make people love nature and also to work on the conservation of nature. So thank you very much. Thank you also, all participants who joined our session today. Please, if you have any questions, I think you have all the emails here, so we can send all the links and information and reports, important reports that you can use for your work as well. So thank you very much and keep in touch.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.